That way, we've touched on all of the systems overall. I spoke about metabolic flexibility. The idea here is that if we can stress each of those substrates or the use of those substrates across a week, a month, or certainly across a whole year, you have a really well-rounded approach when it comes to your training. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Smart Strength Training Podcast. So I'm hoping you're joining this episode from having already watched the last episode. Now, the challenge with doing these podcasts and trying to keep them in sort of like to 15, 20 minutes to make sure they're sort of digestible is sometimes it's quite hard to cover everything you want to. So I'm very mindful in the last episode that there was a lot of kind of like theoretical knowledge around cardiovascular training and introducing the energy systems. So this is podcast episode 53, and we can kind of think of this one as the how-to version of the last podcast episode. So I'm going to talk about how you actually apply the sort of principle of energy systems within to your own workout. So just to summarize really quickly, we have those three energy systems. You have the oxidative aerobic energy system, the glycolytic energy system, and the phosphocreatine system. So we're thinking of cardiovascular training. We are really thinking about what substrate, what energy that your body can use is the dominant one that's going to fuel that type of activity. It's also important to state, like I mentioned in the last podcast, this isn't you're working in one energy system, it's which one is the most dominant. So to simplify it right down, the oxidative aerobic energy system really is the system you're going to be using or the dominant system you'll be using for anything over 3 minutes worth of effort. For anything between 30 seconds up to about 3 minutes, that's going to be the glycolytic energy system. And then anything under 30 seconds is going to be that phosphocreatine energy system. So we can really think about the intensity and the duration being the thing that sort of pushes us in a direction of using that as the dominant fuel source overall. But as I mentioned, this is very much an idea of like turning up a dial. It's not like a switch that you go from one to the other. So let's talk about the aerobic oxidative energy system. That's the energy system you're spending most of the time in because obviously we are at rest most of the time. But when we're trying to train efficiency in this system and to improve the aerobic system, we want to go to zone 2, which has got a lot of press right now for its benefits. So zone 2 improves mitochondrial density. It improves fat oxidation, which just means like fat usage. It doesn't mean that you're burning fat and losing fat. Well, it does mean you're burning fat. It doesn't mean you're losing fat. It just means that the higher percentage of the fuel that is fueling your workout is going to come from your fat cells. And it really improves your recovery capacity overall. So the idea with this is you want to stay under that glycolytic usage. We want to be around 65 to 75% of your heart rate max. And you can think of that if you're using more of an RPE scale, the rating of perceived exertion scale, somewhere around a 5 or 6. You should be able to hold a conversation. This should be a comfortable but not an easy workout to follow. Now, modality actually kind of really matters for this kind of thing. If you're doing like bike is good, incline walking is good, the elliptical is good, the rower is good. If you've ever tried doing zone 2 work by jogging, it's really hard to keep the heart rate down because jogging comes with a large neuromuscular demand, which is that impact. So it's quite hard to manage heart rate unless someone's already got a really good aerobic base. So it's really common for people that do jogs to struggle to stay in the right heart rate, which is why I think a weighted vest or an incline walk on a treadmill potentially could be really good ways of doing this. It's obviously nice to be outside than it is on a treadmill. So if you can obviously get outside with a weighted vest, that also can be very useful overall. You don't have to have a heart rate monitor. They can be a useful tool, but I do appreciate they are expensive or they can be expensive. One thing I would say is that obviously a lot of people have like heart rate monitors as part of their natural fitness tech. I'm generally quite negative around the accuracy of heart rates, but heart rates at lower intensities on watches is pretty accurate. So if you have a fitness watch, that's great, and that actually will capture the heart rate for this kind of intensity pretty well. One thing I would say is that these sort of workouts, as far as duration is concerned, really sort of anywhere from 20, 30 minutes up to as high as 90 minutes. One of the biggest challenges of this is probably boredom. For anyone that's done zone 2 work and you're there for sort of 60 minutes, it can be obviously a little bit tiresome to do that. Obviously, it's quite nice to have a podcast, something that you can listen to. But the nice thing is the intensity isn't so high that it's going to be a struggle to concentrate when you're doing it. So the idea would be, if you're thinking about like how fast you're walking on a treadmill or your wattage on the bike, the idea would be that sort of like month on month, 6 months later, a year later, you would be able to generate more power. So you're walking at a faster pace on a greater incline, or on the bike, you're generating a greater wattage, but your heart rate is in that 65 to 75%. So as far as the effort your body's having to put into it, it stays the same. But over time, your output starts to improve. So it's not about going slow for the sake of it. It's about teaching your body to produce energy efficiently at low intensities. So there is still a progressive element to this, and this is why it sets the aerobic base. You just think about it logically. If you were able to, I live in Lisbon, so it's super hilly here. So if I was able to walk up the hill to go to sort of a bus stop, but I could do that now, and it really spikes my heart rate through the roof to get there. In 6 months' time, I can do that, and my body is so much more efficient. I barely even notice it. I get up there, my muscles haven't worked that hard, my heart rate stays nice and low. That's what it does. It makes exercise, or it makes effort at moderate to low intensities that much easier. So don't think of it as a waste of time because it's kind of quote unquote easy. Really think of it as setting the base in which you can then build this next energy system and the next energy system on top, which is the glycolytic energy system. That is the next energy system. I categorize this down, or I suggest to categorize this down into 3 main components, 3 main adaptations that we're after. One is lactate clearance. I think most of us have heard of the expression lactic acid. There's lots of misinformation around lactic acid overall, which I touched on the last podcast. But the idea basically of the body's ability to clear lactate and to make sure that acidosis in the bloodstream doesn't start to increase. So lactate clearance is one. Threshold is the other, which is to stay just under the point in which lactate or acidosis starts to become so high that you really notice it and you can't cope with it. And then glycolytic capacity, which is very much trying to stimulate a lot of lactic acid buildup. So you're actually trying to do highly fatiguing work, which increases something called anaerobic reserve. If you think of it as intensities within that, there's a slightly different order to where I've said it. Tempo would be the easier of the 3. Lactate clearance would then be the sort of middle one of the 3, and the hardest one would be glycolytic. So for lactate clearance work, you're looking to do sort of intervals. A lot of this style of training will be intervals. The idea is to build lactate tolerance, improve that clearance of lactate, and to improve the ability to sustain effort and manage fatigue. So you're looking at work bouts of working at sort of 8 to 9 RPEs, that 8 and 9 out of 10, so it's not all out. 30 seconds up to say 3 minutes with a rest to work ratio of around 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. So you might be doing a minute's worth of work and 2 minutes worth of rest, depending on your ability to tolerate that. And you might repeat that for up to 6 bouts. And the idea is that you would start to stimulate lactate, you start to stimulate lactate in the bloodstream. You then do a rest period, but it's an active rest period, so you're not just stopping and letting it all clear. You want to maintain a level of lactate within the muscle or muscles, and then you go again and you go again. So you're teaching the body to buffer lactate and to tolerate that. As I mentioned, you can do that on really any modality that you're training at. It works really nicely on, I think, the bike. For a lot of this stuff actually works really nicely on the bike. Running as well, all these things work on running. Usually if you're doing running, you would need an incline. Then if we talk about tempo, which actually, as I mentioned, is probably one of the easy ones, or the easier of the kind of glycolytic, there is still a huge component of the aerobic oxidative system with this one, because you're about to hear the duration. So it should make sense. This doesn't perfectly match the duration. But you want to be around the part that actually you're not accumulating so much lactic acid or lactate that you can't clear it. So these work bouts are much longer, maybe 10, 20 minutes. And you would do that on an interval format again. So you would do 3 up to say 8 repeats of this. You work out intensity is around 7 to 8 bouts. So the idea really is just trying to not have it get to the point, not to get lactate get to the point that you can't clear it. You're staying just under it, that tempo threshold. So really think of this as your ability to kind of like to control the discomfort, that you can just about manage to tolerate the acidosis, that sensation of burning in the bloodstream as you're doing that training. And then the sort of like the top of this glycolytic form of training is the glycolytic capacity session. So these are much harder bouts of training. So here you're doing around 2 minutes of work at around 90 to 95% effort. So very, very hard, grueling minutes. You then rest for around 2 minutes and repeat 4 to 6 times. So this is going to be a very uncomfortable form of training where you really push the lactate really high, you really push the intensity for that minute. Recognizing that it can't be high intensity. This is still moderate intensity because high intensity is like all out effort for a short duration. People often say like they enjoy high intensity because they like working hard. This style training is horrendous. In fact, most of the glycolytic forms of training, certainly clearance, lactate clearance, and this style training are really, really tough, even though they fall into the moderate intensity camp. So like I said, you've got a minute's worth of work, 2 minute rest, 4 to 6 bouts. And then what you start to see with this type of training is that it gets quite hard to sustain the same effort on the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth bout. Like it becomes very hard because the fatigue really builds. And the idea here is to really build that capacity over time. And then finally, at the top, we have the phosphocreatine system. And this is where things like high intensity intervals sit and sprint interval training also sits. So sprint intervals, we can think of like all out bursts, 10, 12, 15 seconds of maximal work. Whereas a high intensity interval is more likely to be around 20 to 30 seconds. So subtly different, but different enough. Two key components to sprint intervals are going to be your rest periods and your output per repeated bout. And this is where people often go really wrong with this style training. You need to make sure you rest long enough that every bout you're able to match the workload. If you're resting too short and you're not able to hit, if it's the speed or the power per bout, then you're not actually doing what we're trying to achieve here, which is to hit peak outputs. Part of the glycolytic energy system is to manage fatigue overall. So therefore, the work period or the work to rest ratios are actually slightly shorter. Whereas I would suggest to have your rest periods quite long in ratio comparison to the work. So you might have a 3-to-1 rest to work ratio, maybe even more, depending on how hard it is for you to be able to repeat the bout. So if you're doing 30 seconds of work, 60 seconds to 90 seconds of rest, and you're doing 6 to 8 repeats that, you want to watch your work bout to make sure you're able to match the intensity per bout. And the same with your sprint intervals. If you're doing maximum sprint-based work for 15 seconds, 20 seconds all out, and you're doing 10 repeats, you need to make sure that sprint 8, 9, and 10, you're able to match the output that you did in sprint 1. And if you aren't able to, you want to make sure that you rest slightly longer, because the idea here is that peak output. You need to make sure that we focus on the training that we're after to drive the adaptation that we're trying to get from that particular workout. And I guess a word of caution on both sprint interval training and true high intensity interval training. So when we think of true high intensity intervals, you really can't do that on something like a goblet squat, kettlebell swing, burpee. Like that is not going to be hard enough per bout. You can't go maximal work for 30 seconds doing burpees. The most likely thing to break down is your form and maybe your shoulder joint than actually push a particular muscle and a heart rate to that point. So this kind of stuff does lend itself better to maybe a rower, a stationary bike, potentially a treadmill if you've got really good sort of gait mechanics and you're good at working at sprints. But you would do this quite sparingly. I spoke about the sort of like 80-20 rule when it came to doing more zone 2 work. This very much would be you wouldn't do it all the time. It'd be quite like a low exposure to it. So you haven't got to do it too often per week. A quick word on VO2, because often people get quite confused about where a VO2 sits in this. VO2 max is the test of aerobic efficiency. It's not a training zone that we're working at. The VO2 max test itself is a stress test. So you would want to be training at the higher intensities, more towards the glycolytic energy system, say 3 minutes bouts of close to maximal work. That's effectively because that's how the test is going to stress you. But when we go through those energy systems, VO2 max isn't something that lands specifically in one of those substrate systems overall. But it can get quite confusing because I hear VO2 max get spoken about a lot on podcasts. And then people naturally ask me, well, how do I improve my VO2 max? What training zone do I need to work at? And that's not quite how it works. And the truth is that all components of cardiovascular fitness and all the adaptations from each of those energy systems and each of those forms of training is going to help improve someone's overall VO2 max. Now let's talk how you'd put this together into your week of training. Now, obviously, everyone's got different time available to them, so this isn't going to be a perfect blueprint. I mentioned that sort of 80-20 rule when it comes to zone 2 training, so it would make sense that zone 2 would take up the bulk of this overall. So if you were doing, say, 3 cardio sessions per week, I would say 2 of those probably would be zone 2. Then 1 would be either high intensity intervals or the other, or it could be, tempo work or lactate clearance. The nice thing with zone 2 is if you generally go out for walks anyway, you could simply just turn a couple of your walks per week into a slightly longer walk, maybe take a weighted vest, push that a little bit harder, push the pace of the walk so it becomes more of a zone 2 walk. So you haven't necessarily got to add in additional gym sessions or actually go out your way to do more zone 2, because you could just naturally nudge the intensity up of the work you're already doing. And then you could either choose to do one form of glycolytic training or one form of high intensity intervals, or you could just alternate it from 1 week to the next. Do a glycolytic session 1 week on the bike, and then maybe a sprint session the week after on the rower, and then alternate back and forth. But I definitely would put more emphasis and stock into the zone 2 work to build that aerobic base, unless you're training for a very specific goal of an event you're going to be doing soon, and you can quite clearly see that you need to have a different sort of switch towards a particular type of training. A final takeaway is strength training generally is in the glycolytic form of training, but strength training isn't going to improve the forms of cardio we're thinking about, even though we're using as a substrate primarily carbohydrates as a fuel source, because most sets will take 20 up to 40 seconds. They land kind of nicely in that sort of like phosphocreatine system and the sort of top end of the glycolytic system. Don't think of your strength training to actually offer you the benefits of cardio, because they obviously are different types of training. As I spoke about in the last podcast, the idea here is to spread, or I didn't necessarily speak about, but what we don't want to have is a lot of people's cardio ends up just being a lot of glycolytic training. And what I would suggest is to spread your cardio intensities across those different forms. So you do some zone 2, you do some purposeful glycolytic forms of training, and then you also do some high intensity intervals or sprint intervals, but very sparingly doing that. And then across the calendar year, if your aerobic base is getting better, your lactate clearance is getting better, you can generally just tolerate, through doing more threshold work, the ability to sort of buffer lactate and to deal with that. You get used to sort of utilizing carbohydrates better as a fuel source overall. And then again, you tap into that phosphocreatine. That way, we've touched on all of the systems overall. I spoke about metabolic flexibility. The idea here is that if we can stress each of those substrates or the use of those substrates across a week, a month, or certainly across a whole year, you have a really well-rounded approach when it comes to your training. So that's really key. Spread the stress across the week. And this is the kind of stuff I always work with clients on. So if you want help programming your cardio and your strength training, getting your nutrition aligned so you can finally start seeing results, I am available for online personal training.